So yeah, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming so late in the third day. I know it's been hard for some of you, especially those who have been partying, drinking beer and such. So I will start off my presentation. It's called A Link to the Past, or How to Benefit from Classic Game Design. So before I actually start my actual presentation, give you a short introduction about where I come from. Well, this is me. When I was a little guy, I liked two things. I liked animals and I liked computers. So maybe some of the old people in this room will recognize this. This is a Commodore 64, one of the first home computers to be out there. So my dad brought it home and I packed it out. And the cool thing about the Commodore and other computers at the time was you got an instruction manual about this thick with it. It was like 5 pages on how to install the thing, how to hook up the tape recorder and shit. And then there was like 80 pages on how to program the thing, because at those times there were little to no games for it. So I started programming very young on this thing. Then below there's my first video game console. It's a Philips product, one of the first game consoles out there. My grandmother bought it for all of the grandchildren to play on. It was sold as also having educational value. Of course, we only played games on it. So especially those two systems do have a special place in my heart. So yeah, when I grew up and I was a little older, I started joining the demo scene. And this was during the 1990s. And the demo scene consists of people that make non-interactive productions, basically showing off their coding and graphic skills. And the cool thing about the demo scene is that up till this day, I already met like 5 to 10 people here. There's a lot of people coming out of this creative subculture that are still active in the gaming industry today. You have people from Media Molecule, Guerrilla, DICE. A lot of those studios were set up by people from the demo scene. Notch is, of course, a more famous example more recently. And they all have their roots here. So it's also nice, just like events like this, to run into people that are active in the demo scene, say, hey, hi. And it also helps with your networking. So then I did that for a few years. Those were two of the examples that I worked on. The cool thing about the demo scene, one more thing, everything was done in software. So every pixel you see on the screen was manually plotted, manually calculated. There were no 3D acceleration cards or whatever. So this was all done by hand. So this also led to a lot of people that are not only working in the gaming industry, but also working with AMD and NVIDIA and creating the new GPUs. You pay. So then around the 2000s, I graduated, and right after graduation, I started my first company called Karma Studios. And we did games for Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and then the first generation of mobile phones. So both the black and white and the first color screens. So these are two examples of Game Boy games that we did. We also did projects for Disney and EA and some outsourced work. So then after I had my company, and the mobile industry was just starting at that point, and we had like a number of people working for us, and it wasn't enough to support the growing industry at that time. So after a few years, I did two things. I started teaching a few days a week, teaching game development here in the Netherlands, teaching kids to program and project planning and project management, such things. And just for a hobby, for the fun of it, did retro game development. So actually going back to my roots, making games for really old systems on really limited hardware, really limited space, just for the fun of it. It's like a Sudoku if you're a programmer. It's really nice to do, or at least for me, programming an assembler to bare bones. So, and actually became really successful with this. So I was featured in magazines, having great reviews, releasing game on cartridge, even special editions with all kinds of crap attached to it. Even cassette tapes. Yes, people, games were released on cassettes years ago, and I still do that for some platforms. So that is really fun to do. I still do that a little bit, but of course I don't have as much time for it as I have had in the last years. But it does give me some perspective on the topic I'm going to talk about. So what am I doing now? I'm here at the event with my new label called Bitstorm Games, and we make games for both PC, consoles, and mobile. So here are some of the games that I'm currently working on, 2 of those. The last 2 are actually featured on the indie showcase floor. So come check them out if you haven't already. So, getting to the topic. How to benefit from classic games. So before I get into the topic, it's really important to stress this: get to know the classic games. And I don't mean your Pac-Man and your Space Invaders and the usual suspects. Just get to know them. Ideally, play them all, but that's like thousands and thousands of games. Having the game emulator helps a lot to do a lot of the older arcade games. If that sounds like a lot of work, you can also have compilation videos on YouTube. It's usually called top 100 or top 20 of the best games on, and then arcade or Commodore or Amiga or Super Nintendo. Just watch all of them. If you see something you find interesting, try to get the game and look into it a bit further. So this is where it all starts. But you can say, well, we're already copying classic games for years, right? So, yeah, well, okay. Puzzle loop. Yeah, we can just copy it one by one. Spelunker, another more recent example. Sure. So, what's the trick in getting new and original games? Obviously, not just cloning them. So I call this learning how to cook. So I see like designing games is just like learning how to cook. You have a bunch of ingredients you can take from different games and just try to make a nice recipe with that. So I have an example for the game Wild Force. It's currently in development. And I took inspirations from games that are not necessarily associated with the genre that the game ended up being in, or maybe not a genre at all. So here we have a horizontal shoot 'em up, in this case Gradius, but you can replace this for any other shoot 'em up, R-Type, and there's other titles that are similar. Gunstar Heroes is one other example, and a really old arcade game called Sun from the 80s. So take those 3 games, put them in the stove, and get something that resembles Wild Force, where you have like the elements of automatic scrolling from the horizontal shoot 'em up. You also have some of the enemies that come from those kinds of games. Something like Gunstar Heroes or Metal Slug, if you will. It's the run 'em up genre. It's in there, and there are some influences as well from the Sun game. And you end up with this. You put some little indie sauce on top of that, like procedurally generated stuff, particle effects, and the likes. And hopefully you get something that is unique and fun to play, because players will recognize these elements, but because you rearrange them in a new fashion, it will also feel fresh. Well, yeah, that sounds like a lot of work, okay? So, yeah, it is more work than just cloning your games. But it can really be worth it. Because especially if you're a small indie, you don't have a lot of media attention, and it's much easier to get media attention if your games bring something fresh to the table. If you just clone an existing game, even if you reskin it, even if you add new features, it's really hard to convince the mainstream press. So what makes your game unique? What makes your game different from all the other games in that genre? So having something unique really helps a lot. I think our friend from Vlambeer demonstrates that very well. But beware, not all food tastes good. So make sure to playtest these type of games more than other games, and playtest them at an early stage. This can be scary because you really don't know. Maybe people will just dislike it, but it gives you good player feedback. So don't wait too long with playtesting. And if you really just want to clone a game, at least try to reskin it a bit or add something new to the genre that isn't there, and just instead of copying it like so. Okay, so how about 3D games then? Working for 2D games because all your classic games are 2D, right? Well, here's my solution and my secret sauce that I use. PlayStation 1, or as I like to call it, the 3D treasure trove of 3D games. So this system was out in 1996, and this was the time where people were all making 2D games at the time, just as most of the indies are doing now. And they are making the transition to 3D, just as we are doing now. And as a result, there was a lot of experimentation. And you can actually, if you watch the game for like a certain developer, you can actually see their progress. So I have one example today. It's called a little studio back in the day called Core Design that later became known for their Tomb Raider franchises. So this is actually the process they went through. So they started with doing like games on the Amiga and Mega Drive and such. Like this example, Chuck Rock is your typical platform game, just in a prehistoric setting. So they took that setting and made something that resembles like a Mario Kart with some 3D stuff in there, but still they did have some CD audio in there. It was released on the CD32, for example. So they started experimenting with better audio and doing some of the 3D. And then the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn, nobody remembers, came out. And they started to do started to experiment with 3D games. But if you come from a 2D background, this is really hard to wrap your mind around. So what they did, they took a proven concept that worked in 2D, Streets of Rage or Final Fight. It's a typical beat 'em up from those times. And they tried to make it in 3D, literally from 2D to 3D. And they even approached Sega, who had the Streets of Rage license. We want to do a Streets of Rage in 3D. Sega said, well, no. So they gave it a different name, but it's basically a Street of Rage in 3D. And what you can see, the whole game plays on a flat background. So that's pretty much like a 2D tile map. You can run across different pieces. And it's not only the collision that it helps you with collision, but it also helps you with adding gameplay elements like triggers or picking up certain. You can just, if you really want, you can use like a 2D tile editor, make all the floor tiles, and then replace all the floor tiles for a 3D object, and you're halfway there. So this is the first thing they started working on. And this led to a game called Ninja. So here you have more a action-adventure type of game, where they still have like a flat background, but there's some some height differences in there, and there was much more interactivity with the game. So instead of just beating up guys and running into walls, you could actually pick up treasure chests and pull levers and such. So they really improved on actually the gameplay aspect of it. And this finally led to Tomb Raider. So once you know the story, take a good look at Tomb Raider, you can actually see that everything is here still tile-based. It's all squares. These are all cubes that are stacked on top of each other, left and right. You wouldn't notice it as much because especially in the later editions you have like slopes and stuff. So yeah, the floors, they run the slopes, but all the walls are just 90 degrees angles, which helps again with the collision, helps again with the gameplay elements. So I think this is a good example of showing how a 2D company became a successful 3D company and the steps they took to accomplish it. So Core Design wasn't the only one that was doing this. A lot of companies were at the time. Some of those turned into actual 3D genres we know today. Some of those didn't. It doesn't necessarily mean because they're bad games. Really good game design in there, which is why I call it PlayStation 1 and Treasure Trove. There are really good game designs in there that are still waiting to be used for 3D games. Okay, this is the next step. So the really good games ready to be used for that. And especially at the time when we're looking to maybe as an indie doing 2D games, starting into doing 3D games. Those games aren't that complex to make. Those were made by 4 or 5 people back in the day. So it's able to do this with a small indie team. So if that doesn't work, there's always the trick of wrapping an existing 2D game and wrapping it on a geometric shape and equals instant success. So you have Superstar that sold millions and millions of copies on PlayStation. Same thing with the PlayStation 4, Defender, wrapped it around the cylinder, and you will have 3D games. That was my presentations. Any So what are the questions?
So, when you like do this kind of thing, do you generally just pick 3 games and ask yourself what cool things can I take out of this, and then just mash them together, or do you like actively think through all the games you know and like think of what would work well together? Like, which one do you pick?
Yeah. So this comes back to knowing your best games. So even when I teach and my students say, yeah, I want to do this kind of game, I always give them like 3 or 4 choices that I like quite similar to them, but then also enough. So the more games you play, the more games you know, the more games you can name or try out that have similar stuff. So if I'm going to mash up some genres and I just think of the genre first, yeah, what would be by replaying them, I discover some things that they do that work really well for that game, and then I can implement new laws and use them in my game.
So a lot of the classic games that you're talking about are 2D. Are there any 3D classic games with mechanics or design elements that you would consider classic, or that could be brought forward into the new 3D games? Like you said, the indies are 2D transitioning. So are there any past examples of 3D games that have good design that could come over?
I had a whole slide. But yeah, so on the one side, you have the PlayStation 1 games, or sometimes PlayStation 2 even, or Sega Saturn, or Dreamcast. Those all have some great untapped gameplay elements. Those go from the really straightforward, where just like fun multiplayer game, even something like Micro Machines is really would be considered nice. I think they actually brought that to mobile already. But also very obscure Japanese stuff, so just line graphics and other stuff. So PlayStation 1 is something I would look at. More modern games. Yeah, usually the cooler, funnier, new and exciting mobile games also could choose from those classic games, because we're able to match them in ways that you wouldn't recognize in the so PlayStation 1 would be my choice to go to, or any of the systems from that era. Answer your question? I teach in Ede. It's MBO college, but we teach most MBO college focus on game design or game art. We focus on game programming. So we deliver new programs. We go work with game industry, app industry, or go on to just like
I see one more hand.
I hear you get a lot of inspiration from your past. Do you ever feel handicapped? If you look at all the new talent that gets this Unity box of goodies, and then just can get into trying all these kind of gameplay, how do you feel the level of play is now compared to what you've been used to doing and working hard to just get that one pixel up there?
Yeah, it works the other way around. So it's really hard to get noticed these days. This is something that is what all the indies are struggling with. Like back in the day, you just needed skill. So yeah, I would do better if I was born like 10 years ago and actually make commercial games or something like Conquer 64. Because if you have skill, there's only so many games that are out there. As for Unity and other engines being readily available, I think that's a good thing. It leads to creativity. I think even Mark Cerny, in one of the speeches, and I think this is what he meant, like there's room for all kinds of experimentation, but you're not bounded by technology or other things.
Sorry.
Sorry? Oh, it's so hard to pick. It's like killing your children. It's not even my children. Killing children in general. No, it's really hard. I have a number. I like outrun games a lot, like arcade a lot. Eco, PlayStation 2 is one of protocol, John.
What language or languages does your school teach in, and what languages do you see for the future?
Right.
Taking precedence.
Yeah, we always start up with C++. If you want to do or actually get a grip on programming itself, it's a good starting point, because I actually teach students once you know the programming in C++, you can handle any language. And this is what we see like when you go to internship. They say like, oh yeah, but I'm still scripting language you guys use. Yeah, okay, give it to me. And I can do my thing. I can do my gaming thing in that language. So it's a really good starting point. We also started, so next to that we do give a little, like 10 weeks of Unity, because once we are at that stage, we don't need a lot of time to get into Unity. But we also started giving the first years HTML5. So we moved away from ActionScript already 2-3 years ago, because we saw like, okay, right now it's running like shit. Starting to, but by the time they graduate, like the speed isn't it anymore. So things will run fluidly. So C++ just because it's a good base to start from, you can branch into anything from there. And then HTML5 just for the web, and that's what we're doing more about.
One final question: does your school offer programming courses outside of, say, going through a whole MBO thing?
Yes, well, what we do get students that come from a higher education. They say, oh, it's cool design, part, just give me some hardcore programming. But so it's like a 1 or 2 year course where you can get in. And also personally, I do teach some stuff outside of work.
Okay, we run out of time for questions. Thank you so much for the great presentation.